apologize. Ready. Good afternoon. This is the Douglas County Board of County Commissioners Land Use and Public Hearing. Today is Tuesday, October 12th, 2021. It is 2:33 in the afternoon. We just did the Pledge of Allegiance, so we will skip that part. We will go to the attorney. Do we have certification for the item on today's agenda?
Yes, we do, Madam Chair. There is one item on today's agenda. It is the Sterling Ranch Plan Development Amendment to Water Appeal that was first noticed for September 14th, 2021, and it has been properly continued until today. With that, you have proper notice and jurisdiction to proceed.
Thank you. Do any commissioners have disclosures for the item on today's agenda?
I have none.
No, ma'am.
And I have none. There is no land use meeting today. Number 3, the public hearing agenda item A, the Sterling Ranch Plan Development Amendment to the Water Appeal. Brett Thomas for staff.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Brett Thomas representing Plan Services. Request is for approval of an amendment to the Sterling Ranch Water Appeal, or Sterling Ranch Water Supply Standards Appeal. Project number is MI 2021-004. Sterling Ranch LLC is the applicant. The applicant requests approval of an amended and restated appeal. The current request is intended to streamline and clarify multiple provisions within the appeal, including the removal of various sections and appendix material. One significant change is to allow the Sterling Ranch Community Authority Board to establish its own water demand standards for Sterling Ranch, subject to review and approval by the Board of County Commissioners as part of future development applications. An appeal to the standards of Section 18A begins with submittal of an application. Following a review period by referral agencies and the public, notice is given for public hearings before the Planning Commission and Board of County Commissioners. Comments from surrounding HOAs and the Rural Water Authority, primarily centered on the opinion that the amended appeal would restrict the board's authority, that a lack of specific data would result in an underestimate of water demands, and that the developer should not delay the build-out of water infrastructure. The applicant has provided written responses to the referral comments, the Division of Water Resources, South Metro Fire, Rural Water Authority, Roxborough Park Foundation, and Chatfield Community Association. In addition, a response from Levier's Water and Sanitation District was received prior to the Planning Commission hearing, which expressed concern with removal of language related to the Chatfield Water Supply Framework and possible impacts to future renewable water resources for its community. Planning Commission considered the applicant's request for approval at a public hearing on August 9th. Public testimony was provided by the president of the Levier's Water District, indicating that they have been offered water by Dominion. He asked that Levier's be given more time to work out financing and grants to take advantage of Dominion's offer. Following the Planning Commission hearing, Dominion provided a letter to Levier's, which states Dominion will hold the water supply option open for Levier's so long as both parties continue to act in good faith through negotiations, but at a minimum through December 31st of this year. The letter is attached to the staff report. The commissioners asked various questions of the applicant to clarify the membership structure of the CAB, water conservation covenants, potential future cost savings for ratepayers, and what the term reasonable request meant for the county's ability to obtain information. Also, the status of the Chatfield Valley Water Supply Framework commitments and other details. Commissioners added a condition of approval that the applicant include a fourth approval standard into the appeal to mirror the standards in Section 18A as was recommended by staff. The recommended approval standard has now been included in the appeal as Section 3.2 in the approval standards section. Planning Commission recommended approval of the appeal subject to 2 conditions by a vote of 5-0. The proposed appeal is applicable to the entire Sterling Ranch PD, which is outlined in red on this zoning map. The site is located generally west of the intersection of US Highway 85 and Titan Parkway in the Chatfield Valley. Sterling Ranch PD extends north and south of Titan Road, between Moore Road and Rampart Range Road. As shown on the aerial, the Sterling Ranch PD is west of Moore Road, south of Chatfield State Park, east of Rampart Range Road, and north of agriculturally zoned land. The property was rezoned from Agricultural 1, Rural Residential, and General Industrial to planned development with approval of the Sterling Ranch PD by the board in July of 2013. Associated with the approval of the Sterling Ranch PD, The board also approved the Sterling Ranch Water Supply Standards Appeal for certain provisions to Section 18A of the zoning resolution. The applicant is proposing to make changes to the appeal document as described within pages 2 and 3 of the staff report and as summarized here. Update the definition section, restate and clarify the water documentation submittal requirements for a development application, remove sections related to scope of appeal, water conservation covenants, service plans for retail water districts, timeline, Chatfield Valley Water Supply Framework, advisory panel, Dominion Board, and annual water information. Also includes separate sections to include approval standards and water demand standards, including the ability for CAB to establish its own water demand standards. Include a section granting greater autonomy to Dominion and CAB in decisions related to water infrastructure development. Commit that the ratio of renewable to non-renewable water supplies will be 70-30 ratio at build-out. Establish that applications for major amendments to the PD are required to include water documentation. Continue to allow for the use of rainwater harvesting where permitted by state. Continues the commitment for the CAB to request the Colorado Conservation Board review its water conservation plan. Include a new wholesale water and wastewater cumulative service commitment template letter from Dominion, and include a new water and sanitary sewer service template letter from the CAB. The approval standards for an appeal are set forth in section 1808A.07 and listed on this slide. Staff's assessment of the approval standards is discussed in detail within pages 7 and 8 of the staff report. Section 1808A.07 of the zoning resolution sets forth the parameters for the board's determination on the appeal request as noted on this slide. Staff has evaluated the appeal request in accordance with sections 1808A and 1809A of the zoning resolution. Should the board find that the approval standards for the appeal are met, the following proposed conditions should be considered for inclusion in the motion. Condition number 1, prior to recordation, all minor technical corrections will be made to the amended and restated Sterling Ranch Water Appeal document to the satisfaction of Douglas County. And condition number 2, all commitments and promises made by the applicant or the applicant's representative during the public hearing and or agreed to in writing and included in the public record have been relied upon by the Board of County Commissioners in approving the application. Therefore, such approval is conditioned upon the applicant's full satisfaction of all such commitments and promises. This concludes staff's presentation. I'm available to take questions on the staff report at this time. We also have Tom Hatton with Applegate here. Otherwise, Brian Connolly is prepared to present on behalf of the applicant.
Questions for staff?
Brett, thanks for that presentation. I do have a number of questions, but I'll hold those until the applicant's presentation is concluded.
And you have none. Okay, with that, we can have the applicant come forward.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. While Brett pulls up the presentation, I will give my name and address for the record. My name is Brian Connolly. I'm with the law firm of Otten, Johnson, Robinson, Neff, and Raganetti. And our business address is 950 17th Street, Suite 1600 in Denver, 80202. And my last name is spelled Connolly. Good afternoon. It's good to see you all. Nice to be the only item on the agenda. So I'm going to go through a very brief presentation on the water appeal amendment, and then we'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have. We have several members of the team here with me today. So I am here representing Sterling Ranch LLC. Brock Smethels is here. He's the Vice President of Development, or Vice President of Sterling Ranch LLC. And then we've got Andrea Cole from Dominion and Denise Hoganis from the Sterling Ranch Community Authority Board here as well. So we should be able to answer any questions that you have on a variety of topics. Just a little bit of orientation. I know that you are all familiar with where Sterling Ranch is. This is I don't know how recent photograph it is. It's 2 years old. So actually there's a lot more build out than what you see in this photo, but sort of underlines one of the things that is a message of our presentation, which is that Sterling Ranch is become a mature community as it has continued to build out. Just more imagery capturing that concept. So as I said, Sterling Ranch is now a mature community. The original water appeal that is governed or governs the development of the property today was approved long before there was any development in Sterling Ranch. And so one of the goals of this effort to amend the water appeal is to sort of acknowledge the fact that we now have experience with development in Sterling Ranch, and the updated water appeal is intended to reflect that. The existing water appeal, you've seen the red line that's in your packet. You've undoubtedly seen the original water appeal. It's a very lengthy document. It's cumbersome to work with and really even understand what it's saying in some places. And it's also cumbersome for the applicant, for the developer and for staff in terms of a lot of the submittal requirements that are contained in it, the procedural requirements that are contained in it. So one of the goals of this effort was to streamline the water appeal. Substantively, what the current water appeal does, which has become a problem for the community, is it requires Dominion first to acquire and retain more water than is needed to serve the community, vastly more water than is needed to serve the community, given current demands. And it also requires Dominion to build infrastructure far in advance of when it's needed to serve the community. And what that has resulted in is extra costs for Dominion and extra costs for the developer. The extra cost to Dominion is then passed on to the ratepayers in Sterling Ranch. So these requirements that are in the existing water appeal really result in costs being passed on to the community, which in our view are not necessary, although the discussion of those costs and how those might be ameliorated will be for another day, because our goal in this water appeal is really relates to process, is creating a process for changing and updating those demand standards at some point in the future. So we're not here today to really talk about any substantive demand standards that might be adopted. Those will be presented to you at a future hearing in connection with a preliminary plan approval. What we're talking about today really is the process of how we get to that conversation. So just to bring us back to why you as the Board of County Commissioners hear these things, state statute requires that you review water supply as part of development applications. And so these are direct quotes from state statute. The first thing is local government shall not approve an application for development permit unless it determines in its sole discretion, so the board's sole discretion, after considering the application and all the information provided, that the applicant has satisfactorily demonstrated that the proposed water supply will be adequate. So the whole goal of this water appeal is to create a process for you to evaluate water demand standards to determine that water supply that will be provided to Sterling Ranch will be adequate. I've also copied in the definition of adequate. There is a definition of adequate in the state statute, and it says adequate means a water supply that will be sufficient for build out of the proposed development in terms of quality, quantity, dependability, and availability to provide a supply of water for the type of development proposed, and it may include reasonable conservation measures and water demand management measures to account for hydrologic variability. At some point, when an application comes before you to adjust the water demand standards, we'll talk more about conservation measures and water demand management, because that's an important feature of what Sterling Ranch is doing today. So the amended appeal that is before you today, it does not change anything about water supply or demand requirements today. We are not asking for any changes in those things. We are simply changing the process for how we would bring changes in demand standards to you in the future. A few key points just to refresh your memory. What we're asking for, we're allowing Sterling Ranch CAB under this amended appeal to set water demand standards, but those water demand standards would come to you for ultimate approval. So the CAB would be in a position of requesting a demand standard. It would need to provide documentation. All that documentation would come to you in connection with a plat application, and then you would have the opportunity ultimately to determine whether that demand standard is adequate or sufficient to meet the statutory obligation of the development. This also would require Dominion to make infrastructure improvements concurrently as water demand materializes through the build out of the community. So in other words, not advancing infrastructure improvements well before that infrastructure is needed to serve the community, but it would just ensure that just like you time road improvements or utility improvements, things like that, you would be timing those improvements from Dominion as the community is building out. We're streamlined the documentation standards in the appeal, so we have now come up with the idea of having a single submittal of all the documentation that would be required to support a particular demand standard, rather than resubmitting it with every plat. And so your staff would not have to review it multiple times over. It would fix the demand standard moving forward, wouldn't require a subsequent resubmittal of the same information. We do have standard form service commitment letters attached to the appeal as it's been drafted. The goal of that is, again, to just sort of streamline it so we have a form submittal letter that can be used, that staff can evaluate, and that's more streamlined than what we have now. And then we also contemplate that the county can request additional documentation as needed to support demand standards going forward. So just a few items of clarification. These relate to things that came up during the application process, came up at Planning Commission. The first is that, again, and I feel like a broken record, this is all about process. We're not changing anything substantively, so we're simply changing the process for how we might request a change in demand standards in the future. Secondly, the county approves the demand standards. So I think, some of the referral commenters were maybe a bit confused that we were trying to create a process whereby the CAB would adopt demand standards, but the county would have no authority to review that. The language of the appeal itself provides that you, the Board of County Commissioners, will ultimately approve whatever demand standards are adopted for Sterling Ranch. So the ultimate authority to determine those lies with the board, just as it always does. The documentation requirements are established in the appeal, and we're also allowing the county to request whatever other information might be reasonable in order to support a demand standard. Again, I think some of the referral commenters were confused that maybe we were saying, the county can't request additional information. That's not true at all. We have a catch-all provision in terms of the documentation standards that say the county can request additional information as needed to support the demand standard. Current demand standards won't change as a result of the application. So the demand standard that was established in 2013 that was in the current water appeal remains in this water appeal as the demand standard, the 0.4 acre feet per single family home. That will be the demand standard until we bring you an application to change the demand standard. So nothing about this appeal is changing the demand standard that's out there today. And then finally, there were some questions about the Chatfield Valley framework. Andrea can certainly speak in greater detail about the Chatfield Valley framework. You might recall that the 2013 water appeal contained this notion of the Chatfield Valley framework for Dominion to eventually offer and provide water supply to existing districts that offer water service in the Chatfield Valley. Dominion has met its obligations under the Chatfield Valley framework, and so the purpose for removing that from the water appeal is simply acknowledging that those obligations have been met. And Andrea can speak in greater detail to that if you have any questions about that. So going through your approval standards for a water appeal, the third one doesn't really apply because we're not appealing the timing of determination of adequacy of water supply, so that one doesn't really apply to this application. But from our perspective, the request will not be detrimental to public health, safety, and welfare. The goal of this appeal is to ensure that residents and property owners in Sterling Ranch have sufficient water supply, that there is sufficient reserve capacity as needed with hydrologic variability, and it's also intended to reduce the costs of delivery of water to the ratepayers in Sterling Ranch. The second approval standard, it's maybe debatable whether this one applies as well, because we're not really appealing the water demand standards today. We're setting a process for changing the water demand standards in the future. We also are not really appealing the documentation standards either. But that being said, we do believe that the appeal does allow the county access to the appropriate amount of data and information that will be necessary for you to make a determination in the future as to whether a particular demand standard would allow for an adequate water supply in terms of quality, quantity, availability, and dependability. So with that, that concludes my presentation, and we will be very happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. Any questions for Mr. Connolly?
Mr. Connolly, I want to thank you and certainly the members of Sterling Ranch for being here with us today to provide what I think is really a creative alternative and potential solution to a series of ongoing conversations that we have had. So I appreciate the sound legal work and all of the engagement you've had with our county staff on this. Looking at the application, so just going back to the initial request, and maybe this question is directed towards staff. So Brett, you talk about Section 2 being removed and Section 3 being removed in its entirety. Can you just summarize for the record what those deletions entail?
Sorry about that. The previous Section 2, former Section 2, was the scope of appeal that was removed in its entirety. That's now provided for in a separate narrative. And then the former Section 3 water conservation covenants, which was also removed in its entirety. The referenced covenants have now been recorded against the property.
I read that. I don't know if you have any additional detail on that. We do have the red line, but for the record, if you have any additional substance on that.
I'd be happy to jump in.
That'd be great, sure.
The Section 2, the scope of appeal, is really sort of prefatory language about what the purpose of the appeal is, and it doesn't really have any legal force to it. So as Brett mentioned, that information we included in the narrative about why the appeal exists. It's just not. It doesn't have any legal effect. And as Brett noted, the water conservation covenants that are required by Section 3, they've already been recorded against the property. They can't be changed at this point. So the deletion of that section really acknowledges that they have been recorded.
Okay, so that's helpful. I think it's helpful for the public that may be reviewing this and see those items in the packet. So I think it's really important to identify that in our previous hearings regarding this matter, one of the questions that the commissioners asked of the applicant was for data associated with the water demand standard. And I really appreciate the potential solution that is being contemplated today. Specifically on page 14 of the application, it says the water appeal amendment contemplates that such evidence that we may request could include anonymized water use data, and in the event the applicant requests a change in the water demand standard for the particular land use within Sterling Ranch. I think that is a fantastic opportunity for flexibility and for us to get the information that is necessary to make a good decision on a case-by-case basis. I will say that working in land use in the private sector for 20 years, what's very important is that there is predictability in government and that conversations are held to and that it's not a change or a switch in lanes once a decision becomes critical. Time is money. And so I think the private sector needs to be able to rely upon predictable standards. I'm also a fan of the notion associated with paying as you go and building as you go, as opposed to overbroad and potentially unnecessary demands. That said, it's also incumbent upon the applicant to ensure that those future demands are met. I want to make reference to the referral comments and a couple of items from the community associations that popped up. And then just give the applicant an opportunity to refer to the responses that you provided. I'm looking specifically at the Rural Water Authority of Douglas County. And let's see here. the Roxborough Park Foundation, the Leviers Water and Sanitation District, and then, of course, let's see here, you guys already have it. It's the Chatfield Community Association, primarily encouraging the county to deny this request, stating that the application takes away the authority of the county for any present or future oversight of water demand standards, and that it's the obligation of the developer to secure sufficient funds for development. I just want to identify that, certainly with this solution that's being presented, Sterling Ranch will submit those applications at a later date and will include the data that is supportive of such requests. And to your point, this is about process, and that process will allow the county to still review on a case-by-case basis. So I will say, when I receive comments from the community that present a parade of horribles or the sky is falling perspective, it loses credibility for me. So there has to be an actual issue here, and in my mind, this is sufficient to ensure that water demand is met with the appropriate timing and the needs of the community. So I don't know, Mr. Connolly, did you have anything additional with regard to some of these community responses?
I don't have anything additional. You referenced the response letter that I authored in response to the community comments, and I think that probably sums up our position on those comments. I think, to your point, there may have been a misunderstanding. I don't want to necessarily characterize it as a sky is falling approach, but there may have been some misunderstanding about the scope of the appeal. Certainly, if and when a new demand standard is brought forward to the board in the context of a plat application, the community will again have the ability to be involved in that discussion. There will be a hearing before the Planning Commission. There will be a hearing before the Board of County Commissioners. So, when there is a substantive demand standard amendment, the community will certainly have the opportunity to review that application and be part of the public discourse on that application. And so, I don't think, to your point, Commissioner, we are not trying to, avoid county oversight of anything. The board will have the authority to review and ultimately determine whether a demand standard is appropriate or not. The board will have the ability to request the data that is necessary to support that demand standard, and that information will be available for the public to review.
Yeah, I think that's great. I'm looking at the Leviers Water and Sanitation District referral response, and they talk about concerns related to the future availability of renewable water. And it sounds like Dominion provided that letter to Leviers after the Planning Commission hearing, indicating that, as long as things are moving forward in good faith, Dominion will continue to hold the water for Leviers. Are there any ongoing concerns or issues associated with the Leviers Water and Sanitation District?
I would defer to Andrea Cole from Dominion to talk about any ongoing discussions with Leviers.
Okay, thanks. And maybe while Andrea's coming up, Brett, if you could answer that, have we received any additional comments or responses from Leviers on this?
We have not received anything since the letter that's in the staff report and then the testimony they provided at the Planning Commission. The last piece of correspondence we have was Dominion's letter that was also included in the staff report. Okay.
So it's my understanding that Leviers Water and Sanitation District is comfortable with the letter that Dominion provided.
We have not received an indication either way from Leviers.
So it's just, okay. Okay, thank you, Brett.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner. My name is Andrea Cole, C-O-L-E, General Manager for Dominion Water and Sanitation District, located at 9250 East Costella Avenue, Suite 315 in Greenwood Village, Colorado, 80112. In response to the question regarding Leviers, Dominion continues to engage and meet with both Matt and Sarah Shepard with Leviers. And we have a meeting set up on Thursday to continue those discussions and work in good faith towards a solution. Also, shortly in front of the county will be a proposal that will provide a solution for Leviers on both a wastewater and water proposal.
Andrea, thank you. That's my understanding as well. My last question is with regard to the reasonable request for data that may occur in the future. And I guess the linchpin on that is reasonable. How are we defining what a reasonable request is?
Commissioner, that question came up at Planning Commission as well, and I think it's a fair question. I mean, ultimately, you know, I guess my view of it is that anything a local government does is sort of couched in reasonableness, right? That application requirements for any land use application need to be reasonable and tied to, you know, the subject matter of the application. I think that if we were, you know, just to maybe use a hypothetical situation, if we were proposing a demand standard, you know, one of the things that has come up in discussions on this application in the past is whether water use data from other communities would be appropriate to use to justify a water demand standard in Sterling Ranch. And so, you know, certainly if, you know, the county were to ask for data surrounding another community's water usage that would support a new demand standard, you know, that would be reasonable. Asking for water demand or you know, water usage from every community in the state of Colorado would seem to be an overly burdensome request. So that's what it's sort of intended to get at. I understand that it maybe it introduced more confusion into the discussion than it needed to, but I think it's really just a reflection or a memorialization of you know, the sort of legal limitations on local government in sort of the general sense.
Well, that's helpful, and I hope it's our reputation in the county to be as, not to be as less burdensome as possible, but this is an important question, at least for me. If we ask for anonymized water use data in the future associated with Sterling Ranch, is that within your understanding of reasonable?
I think it would depend on the context of what the demand standard is that we're trying to put forth in front of the county. We've certainly acknowledged that we would be willing to give anonymized water use data if that were requested, and if it were relevant to whatever demand standard we're seeking to get approved.
Well, I think that's what I'm reading and writing here, is that you would provide that. I just want to confirm for the record that would be deemed reasonable in your view. Mr. Connolly, that's all I have. Thank you.
Okay. I don't know if you want to hear a comment from another member of the team.
Sure.
Hi there, this is Denise Hoganes, Hogenes. I'm the general manager for Sterling Ranch Cab. The address there is 9350 Roxborough Park Road, Littleton, Colorado, 80125. I just wanted to add to what Brian was saying. One of the things that we may find as unreasonable to fit into that example category would be, instead of asking for, say, monthly data, which would be very easy for us to do, if, let's say, Douglas County asked us to provide hourly or daily data, we might find that a little bit more unreasonable. So that's the kind of example that we're getting at, is we have data to what level it needs to be synthesized. We just really think that monthly data would be, more useful. And so we don't want to get into hourlies or dailies or things like that.
Ms. Hoganes, I think that's a helpful clarification. And let me just ask our water consultant if, in his view, that would be acceptable for any inquiry that we might examine in the future. Is monthly water data sufficient?
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Glad to be here. It's my first time. My name's Tom Hatton. I work with Applegate Group. Address is 1490 West 121st Avenue, Westminster 80234.
And how do you spell your last name, please?
Hatton.
Thank you.
Thank you. If the devil's in the details with a question like that, and the context does matter. For example, there may be, monthly data may work fine for each individual home, may not work fine for an irrigation system, for example. But regardless of how that is handled, the county will request data or any documentation or whatever from the applicant. If the applicant chooses not to provide it, we would then go ahead and do our analysis. And at some point, there'll be a hearing, and you will know then what that request was and you'll be able to make a judgment too as to whether that is reasonable or unreasonable. So I guess my point is, it's almost impossible to answer the question in the present context without exactly knowing what that is, but it will be transparent. And you will know what that is or was, and you'll be able to make that assessment too.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
You bet.
And thank you to the board for the indulgence on the line of inquiry. That is all I have.
Commissioner Teal.
Actually, Commissioner Layden, he did ask the questions that I had in mind, but I'd like to have an opportunity to ask Ms. Hoganess to come back before us, and I'd like to ask about the collection of the data, which was the most recent subject.
Sure.
So I actually happen to know a lot about data, and data is data. It always reveals what it reveals. I'm interested in the collection of data. You made the example that it would probably be very reasonable to provide monthly data. Why is that reasonable? How are you going to collect that data?
So right now, our water meters, we do collect monthly data in order to send out the bills. Just as a reminder, the CAB is a retail water provider, so we buy from Dominion, sell to the homeowners. Just like most water utilities, we send out monthly bills. So we read meters monthly, we send out those bills according to usage. And so that's where we're saying that it would be easier for us to coordinate that with our typical billing cycle.
If you were asked to provide data by day, by address of water user, how would you collect that data?
Well, we would have the ability to collect that because right now we're actually implementing a technology that gives us data every 15 minutes, actually. So while we have that data available, actually getting it to where it's usable is a different matter entirely. So is it possible? Yes. Is it costly, time-consuming for the ratepayers and for staff? Yes. So could we do it? We could. So we're not saying that we wouldn't do those things. We're just saying that as a matter of practice, we would prefer to go off of monthly. But could we? Yes, we could. You know, there was a discussion about conservation, and the reason that we have this technology is so that we can help our homeowners detect leaks and then further not waste water. So we have that system not so that we can produce bills, but so that we can not waste water. So we actually, our system will alert a homeowner if they have a leak for more than 8 hours in a one-day segment. So our purpose for having that technology is to conserve, not to use it for bill production or things like that.
So it sounds like you're telling me that the data that is retained by a software system, by a software application, is in order to generate alerts in the case of overusage,
That's
a temporary emergent overusage. Is there anyone monitoring this data, this hourly data, each day by address?
Yeah, so a person, no. It's a technology called AquaHawk, and it will actually, it does not alert the CAB to overusage, it alerts the direct homeowner. The CAB gets to implement the parameters by which it alerts that homeowner, but we don't get alerts. I'm sure we could tell it to alert us, and we could, you know, make provisions that way. But right now, it only alerts the homeowner to say, hey, you may want to check your system because you've got this much water running for this period of time.
So is there anyone today who is any one individual that is a part of their duties and responsibilities is reviewing this data by address of rate user each day?
No, sir.
Is there any one individual in the organization that on a monthly basis is reviewing this daily or every 15 minutes data by address as a part of their monthly job task?
No, sir.
Do you have a standard form built, a standard report built, that you just have to do press the button and generate this data based upon a hourly or daily usage per address of rate user?
I believe so, but I would need to get back to you. I will tell you that we just launched this AquaHawk system. Our first billing with it was July 15th, and that measured our June usage. And so we are in the very beginning stages of launching this. We've already received 6 homeowner thank yous for launching the system because they were one of the ones that received an AquaHawk alert. They were able to get their system checked, and all 6 of them, not surprising, had small irrigation leaks. And so we do know that the system is effective. Just like when you get a new iPhone and you're learning how to use it, we're still learning internally how to use it, but we also already know that it's been effective.
And you've had 6 since July.
15th was the first implementation that we have. So, and I'd be happy to share those with you. Most of them have been social media posts thanking the cab for, as one put it, the new toy.
6 out of, how many ratepayers do you have right now?
We have 1,100 right now.
6 out of 1,100, thank you. That's interesting data right there.
So-
See, right there, that's very interesting. Awesome. Okay, I think that's my questions.
Thank you. You had an interesting line of questions, and as you were asking them, I was thinking, if I were a homeowner, I'm not sure that I would want someone watching how much water I was using. To me, that's kind of a personal matter.
Yeah, I mean, that goes to a little bit of it. I've obviously 23 years in the software industry. I've worked with a lot of clients who were trying to deal with big data issues. They wanted to follow trends. They wanted to find buying trends, selling trends in the data that operated their business in order to make business decisions. And yet it always does kind of come back to that, particularly with a major shift in technology we've seen in the last 3 years, whereby you have shared databases between separate customers whom all have their own requirements with their own customers for data secrecy. And so, but like I said, Madam Chair, I actually know a great deal about the acquisition of data, the use of data for businesses making data decisions. So thank you for entertaining my extensive questions. I appreciate it.
So my fellow commissioners have asked most of my questions. I just have one clarifying question for Mr. Hatton. So Mr. Hatton, last year we lived through hearings over and over on this topic. And one sticking point was the amount of data that the county could receive in order to make changes in the water appeal. Is it your opinion, based on everything that you have read here, that the county will be able to get the amount of data? I did hear you say that if we ask for data and we don't get it, that can certainly impact our decision. But I just would like to know, before we make this decision today, do you believe that this agreement will give us access to the data that will give us enough to make the right decisions should we change the amount of water needed for future filings?
I have faith, number one, that the applicant will work with us. And number two, I don't see us getting any more or less data with the new amendment than with the present appeal. Does that make sense?
Can you say that again?
I think, well, with the present appeal, there are certain built-in requirements, but we still may need to request additional data from the applicant that is not codified in the present appeal. I mean, we've already heard what you're hearing right now is exactly the process we're going to have to go through. And you can see how complicated it's going to get. And in order to do that, we're going to have to work with the applicant to get their data. I don't see any reason why that won't happen. We've worked with Sterling Ranch for, I think, 11, 12 years now, since the very inception. We've had plenty of back and forth. We've had lots of negotiations, but ultimately, in the end, we've gotten to the point where we need to get to. Now, we're embarking upon a new frontier, basically, here. But I reiterate that I don't see any reason that we can't get that data, regardless of whether we amend this appeal or not.
Okay, thank you.
You bet.
Before I open citizen comment, are there any additional questions from the board? May I have the timer, Commissioner Layden, please? Thank you. Is that one a timer also, the one behind your computer? I know how to work that one. Maybe I don't know how to work that one.
The challenges of application and data.
I have a timer, I can just keep time, unless you have it.
Okay, so we got this on. So I will open citizen comment. Are there any citizens in the hearing room who would like to address the board? Hello, Dr. Dixon.
Good afternoon.
We have received a one-page document. At the top, it's labeled Table 1. It's going to be marked as Exhibit 1 for today's public hearing.
Thank you.
Jan Dixon, DIXON 4271 Mustang Circle, Sedalia. One of the things that is a very integral part of the water appeal that they have glossed over today is they have repeatedly said that, Dominion has repeatedly said that they have an adequate water supply for build-out. And we just want you to quickly review the chart submitted by Dominion in a previous hearing showing the water supply of Sterling Ranch. And on the right, we have broken out the numbers, separated renewable from groundwater depending on what the state water court has said. And you can see that the amount of groundwater is vastly greater than the amount of renewable. We have excluded any water that does not meet state regulation of a dependable water supply. So given that, looking at the numbers of their portfolio, they do not now meet the 70% renewable commitment. And there's nothing to suggest that they ever will, given that they say this is an adequate water supply for build-out. Since the water appeal was approved back in 2013, Dominion has only purchased 191 acre-feet of renewable water, and the remaining purchases have been groundwater. When Dominion completed the Aurora 250 agreement, they submitted a list of possibilities of 26 water sources, most of which were renewable, but Dominion chose not to purchase any of those beyond the 250 agreement. When the county sold off their shares of Wise Water, Dominion did not purchase any of that water, which would have been considered renewable. And this summer, Castle Pines North Metropolitan District sold off a great deal of renewable water. Dominion did not even show up on the bid list for any of that water. So for a district that's supposedly committed to having 70% renewable water, all they're purchasing is groundwater. Dominion says that they'll have 70% renewable at build-out. So the question is, what is build-out? Who defines build-out? How is it defined? Is it the number of units built? Is it a time limit? If you look at Highlands Ranch, they're still building 40 years after their PD was approved. And what is the mechanism to ensure by the county that that 70-30 commitment is enforced. What happens if Sterling Ranch takes 20 or 30 years to build out? Are they allowed to build basically on groundwater, which is what they have now? And for all of those years, they'll have a negative impact on individuals, on individual wells, small districts, particularly in the Sedalia area where the Cherokee Ranch water is. Mr. Lytle had stated the county had not received any data by Dominion as required. In the previous hearing, Mr. Layden said earlier that he would set aside the public's numbers. But how do you know if a process will work if you don't have numbers to support the premise?
Dr. Dixon, if you could wrap it up, please.
The bottom line is that Sterling Ranch, Dominion, and the CAB need a constant oversight and not have a free hand to do as they please. As far as their expenses, the state requires water at approval. You have no control over that. As far as infrastructure, their partners, the WISE people, Castle Rock, Roxborough, they're all determining the timing of the infrastructure, not the county. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dixon.
Hello, I'm Dennis Larrett, speaking for the Chatfield Community Association. So that would be a 6, not a 3, I believe,
Okay.
on the timer. I've already provided my address. I'm in Littleton, 80125. I provided my address directly to staff, so they have that. Choose not to make it public, as I'm not a business as the others. There are a couple things that I want to point out that in 2013, in order to get the PD and the water appeal approved, Sterling Ranch and Dominion made a lot of commitments, and those commitments should not be removed simply because they now consider those burdensome for the applicant and staff. Those were put in for a reason so that there was adequate monitoring, and that 2013 water appeal was actually a dramatic reduction from the 18A standards, both in water demand standards and the method by which it could be adjusted. You've asked about data and you've asked about how things are done. During the hearings last year, there was a lot of pushback on releasing data, and I'm not sure that that's resolved by the term what's reasonably available. But that data went down to the type of dwelling unit, whether it was single family attached, single family detached, or multifamily, and the water demand for each of those, because the outdoor watering is obviously different on each of those. And that information was all requested and built in to the original appeal. Also in the original appeal is the 70-30 water demand of renewable versus groundwater. There was a comment put up by the applicant earlier that they are being required to acquire and maintain more water than what is currently required. But through filing 5 this year, I don't believe there has ever been a point at which in one of those filings they have shown more than a 5% surplus of water over what their demand is based on the 0.4 acre foot per dwelling unit. And some of those were down to 1% overage, which doesn't even account for full rate loss through the process. There are several things, I think, that the amended water appeal does minimize the county's ability to enforce. It does not adequately address the 70-30 renewable groundwater. The water that's sufficient in terms of quantity, quality, and reliability, because some of the water that is being provided, which is WISE, is not considered reliable by the state. We need to look at that. You need to look at that. It's done through the agreement with Castle Rock, but the reality is that 400 acre-feet of that water is still from well water in the Higher Ranch area that feeds into Castle Rock that had to be proved up.
Mr. Laird, I just want to point out that I reset your timer, so you get your 6 minutes.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you very much, Commissioner Thomas. Bruce Lytle, in his September 20th referral comments, identified an even dozen items that needed to be corrected in the water appeal or that were deficient as the water appeal was written. And as I read the revision, only 2 of those 12 have been addressed. And so I think every one of those should be addressed by you folks to the applicant as to why they wouldn't be addressed. I'm curious why Mr. Lytle isn't here, because he's got more experience with 18A, the water appeal, and this process than anyone else. That's not negative to Applegate, it's just he has more experience in this entire process. The ability for Dominion Water and Sand to supply and meet the standard of adequate quantity, quality, and reliability has to be called into question by the letter that they sent to the Board of County Commissioners regarding the range development just this week. And in that, they specifically stated, and this is a quote, if Dominion had been obligated to provide service to the range, it would have jeopardized the ability of Dominion to provide water service to its current customers. That's just 500 homes in the range development, and yet that could push them over the limit. And as we go through this entire process, what I see in this is that you currently have a water appeal that was established, that was agreed to at PD, it was agreed to by the applicants, many of which were not, people are not representative here, nor was the board involved in 2013. But that's established a process that has not been tested. It required a 5-year term before the data was acquired for each of the elements to determine whether a water demand standard could be adjusted or should be adjusted. It could go up or down. And the mechanisms that were built into that appeal, I think, were a little bit liberal towards the developer and the water supplier, but I think they need to be tested out. And so for those reasons, I think you should deny the application, and that does not preclude the ability from the applicant to come back and look to amend the water appeal later. But it should go through a cycle of actually testing the process that was written and make sure that it works. So
Thank you, Mr. Laird.
Those are my comments.
Are there any other citizens in the room that would like to address this topic? Seeing no one else, Troy, is there anyone online?
Thank you, Commissioner. I have no online comment at this time.
Thank you. I will close citizen comment. Would the applicant like to address any of the comments they heard?
Thank you, Commissioner Thomas. Brian Connolly again for the applicant. I think, so again, the application that we're here on today is about establishing a process. So everything that you heard from the public concerns whether Sterling Ranch is going to meet the 70-30 requirement, whether Dominion has enough water to serve the development, what kind of data is available. All of those things are things that will be presented to you when we present a revised demand standard to you, because that's when the data would be presented. The application that's before you today is all about establishing a process for being able to bring that information to you. If you have specific comment or specific questions about some of the items that were raised, certainly Andrea can address the items related to Dominion's portfolio, We can address questions on, the 70-30 requirement. But I think those are questions that are better suited for another day when an actual application for a revised demand standard is brought before you. I will just make one comment about what Mr. Larrett said about the 5-year review timeframe that was baked into the original appeal. Again, the original appeal was done long before there was any development in the project. There are 1,100 ratepayers, as we heard, in the project, which certainly is a sizable sample of the future build out of the community. It is a mature community. Again, there are costs that are being passed on to ratepayers as a result of the onerous nature of the original appeal. And so what we're trying to do is create a process where we can bring data to you, bring a demand standard to you, bring the justification to you, and then you will have the opportunity to review that information. You will have your water consultant review that information. The public will be able to review that information, and you'll be able to make an informed decision on whether or not to adjust the demand standard.
Questions for Mr. Connolly?
So, Mr. Connolly, I appreciate the response, and I really appreciate the input from the citizens with regard to some of the issues before us today. I do think it is important to identify that we're not reviewing an application for a revised demand standard today, and I heard a lot of comments about that. I have those concerns as well. I think we heard questions about whether or not the applicant is meeting the 70% renewable requirement and issues associated with timing and what is build out. Those are all important questions, but that's really not what's before us today. So I want to remain germane to the applicant's application, and my understanding is the application is related to this process. The process entails being provided with sufficient data to make those decisions. I think my questions around the data and a reasonable request for data have been met. I do want to speak to, I heard Mr. Larrett talk about Bruce Lytle's recommendations, many of which were stricken from this particular appeal. And maybe, Mr. Haddon, if you can walk through those with us and identify how those have changed since we received those recommendations and what you're recommending today instead. And I'm sure Mr. Connolly will stay close in case we have some additional questions for him.
Mr. Hatton, do you need? Yes, that would be great. Thank you.
This is Jeanette Baer for staff. I just want to preface a little bit before Mr. Hatton testifies that at the time that we had Mr. Lytle's comments, it of course was a different appeal document. And at that point in time, we were going down the road of trying to define what the data was. So a lot of it was back and forth on that. And we kind of took a different approach, which was, the county can ask for whatever data it wants. And I think we've since talked to him, and I think he was supportive of that. But there are probably other details in the letter as well that I'm not recalling right now.
Jeanette, I was thinking about you, and you are so great. I knew you had that institutional memory and probably recalled that hearing very well. So let me rephrase my question to ensure that it's just germane to today's application.
May I just ask the date of that document? Is it 20 or 21?
September 30, 2020.
2020, thank you.
There's also another one. Oh, that's from Andrea. Never mind. That's.
February 2020.
Oh, is there a February?
Huh?
Is there a February?
There's February 20th, 2020 as well.
Mr. Ingalls, do you think it's appropriate that we're talking about documents that pertain to an appeal that is not this appeal process?
That's really up to the discretion of the board. This appeal in some form was brought to you previously, and if there's things about that require you to ask questions to decide on this appeal, you can ask those questions. If, on the other hand, you believe this appeal can stand on its face without those questions, that is fine as well. It really depends on what is relevant to the board and what helps you get to a final decision.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, I do remember going through, or partially going through this process. And what I recall was that Sterling did have a much more detailed request for demand standards. But at some point in time, the narrative shifted to the point where we're going now, which is let's just do the process. Let's not try to reinvent the entire wheel now. So if you would like, I can go through the Lytle letter. It's not something that I've reviewed in a very long time, but we can do that.
Well, it doesn't sound like to me, based upon you refreshing my recollection, that any of those recommendations speak to the process that we're considering today. And if I'm wrong about that, then let me know. But I think I heard Jeanette say that you went in a different direction. I think I also heard you say that you have since consulted with Mr. Lytle and he's comfortable with the direction we've gone today.
We've had some conversations. He was keen on making sure that that the approval standards in the appeal mirrored 18A. So we really talked about getting that fourth approval standard, which the applicants have now added back into the appeal document. So it does mirror 18A. And then I think there were some references to the variability of the hydrologic cycle, which I think are, kind of contained within the appeal now. So I think safe to say that the majority of his comments, I think, were addressed through this revision, for what it's worth.
Thank you, and that is sufficient information for me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Connell? Mr. Connolly, there's two conditions here. Do you accept both of those conditions?
Brian Connolly for the applicant, yes.
Thank you. Any other questions, discussion, comments?
Madam Chair, so I guess my comments at this stage of the game are along the lines of, I obviously came onto the board with 6.5 years of experience in a supervising board over a municipal water district. And I actually was a little chagrined to find myself having a little bit of difficulty getting through 18A. And I thought I had seen some very complex water agreements in the past. After the review, after testimony we've heard today, knowing that we are not deciding on a demand standard today, I actually feel very comfortable going ahead and proceeding forward with the revisions that the appeal is based on. One thing I learned in 6.5 years with the municipal water district, when we talk process, you might as well just put dollar signs behind it in parentheses. My questions pertaining to data, and of course, I can certainly understand a consultant desiring data, and I have a very real appreciation for that. But on the other hand, I can think of a Disney World vacation that was paid for by creating a suite of reports that could be push button on demand for a client of my own. And anybody who's been to Disney World in the last 20 years knows that that was a good deal that I did. My problem is that we're not, I can't shake the fact that we're dealing with certainly a wholesale water provider, certainly where you're dealing with a retail water provider, but they don't write the checks. The checks actually get written by people every month in their water bill. And coming from the municipalities, I went to many National League of Cities meetings where it was quite amusing when I would inform people from other parts of the country who managed or who sat on municipal councils as elected officials when I mentioned the cost of water. And there are a number of times that it was true belly laughs when they then informed me that water was an absolute right where they were from, and they'd be hung from the nearest lamppost were they to charge for water. Sewage treatment, you bet. Stormwater, you bet. But drinking water, obviously Colorado's unique. Having lived here virtually my entire life, yeah, I know that, water is not free. It does not just fall from the heavens here. It is something that must be found, must be transported to where people are, and provided to those people in a safe and proper quantity. So considering what we're dealing with today, I feel very comfortable at this time, if it pleases the board, making a motion to approve the amendment to the Sterling Ranch Plan Development Water Appeal with 2 conditions as presented, project file MI 2021-004.
Second.
There's a first and a second. Commissioner Lane, would you like to make any comments before we vote?
I have no further comments.
I'll just go ahead and weigh in that. I understand that we are only making a decision about a process. We are not making a decision about lowering the water standard. And based on that, I'm comfortable making this decision and making it clear to the people who spoke that we are not lowering any water appeal or any rates at this point, that it is the process that we are approving. So based on that, we have a first and a second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye, and that motion carries. Thank you. That concludes today's meeting. The next land use and public hearing will be held on Tuesday, October 19th at 2:30 in the afternoon. Thank you.